Yeah, for this one with it, I know it's kind of a weird topic we're going to be going over with it, but I know we kind of got to go over this whole type of topic. First one with it, it's obviously that's explaining why a world socialist government is not even possible. This is that idea of that NWO and world government ideas that a lot of conspiracy theorists go over and explain why that's not even possible. That's number one. And number two, explain why nationalism is the biggest threat to liberty in the world. Uh, we're going to uh, we're going to basically be going over one historic event to kind of like show, uh, kind of give an idea of why this is a case where it is where nationalism is very very dangerous, and we're going to be using an example of actual conflicts within between socialism and nationalism. We'll use Nazi Germany as an example, in which we saw conflicts between the two, and we will show where a lot of times where socialism really cannot exist uh, beyond small scale experiments without some sort of nationalism, because it cannot hold on its own. And that when you get nationalism is, when it comes down to it, is willing to adapt to basically multiple types of economic situations, and that's what we'll get to the true definition of fascism. Because mind you, fascism is not what they tell you. It's actually being used to uh, hide the definition of a couple different words, but we'll go over that as well. Now, uh, first of all, with it, why there cannot be the idea of this socialist world government, we'll go over first. Basically, when you look at the idea of what they have, uh, when they try to explain this idea of world government, it's theoretically taking the idea of saying that any type of uh, state or province and local government is essentially loses all of its authority, and that you merely have a national government, and you have a you would they would have representation in some type of global governing body, such as like a UN or something like that. And these would basically this would essentially be working on some type of social, quote unquote, socialist government thing on like that level with it. It would not be the idea of some type of either. They would not be able to retain their own ideas as well with it. They would it would be working on this global governing body. Now, the reason why this wouldn't work with it, as we'll go on with it, is being that there is no actual smaller regional governments than basically a representative government, is being that it would be modeled, is what they always say is it'll be modeled after a larger version of what they have in the European Union, meaning you could pass from country to country without any issue. Well, what this means is, in theory, with it is you could pass from not only from country to country within a continent, you could pass from country to country, from continent to continent. Now, this would what it goes now in social. Now, if you try to do this within socialism, now what socialism does with it is they need you to stay within those boundaries, and for them to actually control you, and that's why they use and this would be essentially an aspect of nationalism, and they need you to stay within those boundaries. Well, to do it on a national scale, you're going to have some type of regional control. When you start to lose those state and local regional controls, you're going to create smaller little creations of stuff that are not going to comply with the actual controls on massive scale. And this is the actual problem that they're going to be dealing with. And I think this is something in which what we're going to find, well, what you would find with it is it's not plausible that they could actually have their actual government exist on this massive scale. And this is something in which we would see that this global government, being that they would have to essentially deal with, you're talking we're talking, at least right now, it was like 8 billion people. You're talking 8 billion people they're making decisions for, and they have to control them without any local or provincial or state governments. They have no control over that with it. These have all been dissolved. So you only have the state level, you only have the country level governments. Now at that point with it, you what it called, most likely they've already dissolved even like regional governments from like the continents size ones, but so they don't even have that level. So it's just basically an international level government. We're talking that this is the way they've explained it. So you're talking they have that level, and then they have the countries as the federal level with it. And the federal level are basically working for their own best national interest and negotiating as essentially a representative of their own country. And instead of being like how the UN has like a Security Council, that would essentially go away. In with exception of they might have different committee level things with it, but when it comes down to the thing, it would be equal to the whole assembly and making legislation on that level. And in theory, this is how it would work. Now, the problem being is that every nation would theoretically have the same equal power. And when we talk about this, and then there would be one person elected through all these national representatives, that you would have this. And in theory, with it, your federal government that you would have would be no more than a figurehead. They would have no power, and they would not act in any such way other than basically theoretically announcing the laws. They would have no power over the nation for anything. And this is in theory with it what they would do. So what this would theoretically do is, being that there would be theoretically nobody to theoretically enforce anything, because when it comes down to it is there would be, what's the incentive? They've essentially removed the incentive from each nation, because you would need in this case you would need a lot of people that would be working on behalf to police all these things, working on behalf of them. And if you can't even get people to agree even on a domestic level of how to do these things, and we have even within countries and we have police reacting different ways with it on how to police policies and things, and even within from city to city within even the United States, how are you going to do that from a international level? It's not going to happen, and that happens even on international levels. You have police from precinct to precinct not enforcing laws on a universal basis. And this is going to be the thing with and if they could not even establish some type of ability to sustain itself, even when we saw in these socialist nations throughout history, even to date with it, where they've even had issues with it of sustaining it, and even outside areas with it, such as like even in Hong Kong with it, they can't even get any Hong Kong to actually the people to for them to comply with the mainland China rules. How are they going to get the whole world to comply with these rules? That's why when we talk about it, there's no legitimate ability for it to happen. They're acting like that's why when they come up with these conspiracy theories, they need to look at the legitimacy of it. There is no logistics behind it. Not only that, you would need to essentially theoretically train all these people to comply with whatever types of laws for theoretically brainwashing the majority of the people. And not only that, you need to essentially take at least the means of production with at least a majority of the goods. And when you're talking a lot of people that are very, very wealthy, they're not going to they're not going to hand that over without a legitimate fight. And that's going to cause a serious issue. And how is this even going to be set up? Is some people have come up with the idea that it's going to be some type of oligarchy. Well, if that's going to be the case, then you're never going to essentially have that set up as being some type of militant system. That means you're never going to truly enforce anything, and it's merely just going to be a financial system at the top. That means when it comes down to it, it's merely going to be a global economy and nothing else, and the free movement of people. Now, if you have that, that's merely moving in the definition of liberty. Because what you'd be doing is, if you would be eliminating all those governments that they've gotten all those cushy deals from, guess what? They're not going to have those cushy deals anymore, which is probably unlikely as well. Because when it comes down to it, a lot of those big companies have gotten cushy deals from those governments, and if you eliminate all those if you eliminate all those powers of those state governments and those conflicts they've been going through, what's going to happen is they're going to lose a lot. They're going to lose all those contracts, and it's going to allow all this competition to come through. All that competition is going to change the marketplace. It's going to be a free marketplace, and you're going to have liberty coming through with it. It's just going to, and it's going to be far more like an anarcho-capitalist society. That's not a global governance. It's merely just going to be where you have a bunch of private property and people can move as they freely wish. Yes, it's going to be against the idea of nationalism, and nationalism essentially is a slippery slope to essentially where the government owns everything, because the government essentially can seize property as it sees fit to trap people inside of the system, to create essentially what we're talking about, a national, basically the idea of a national prison. This is the idea of nationalism. The idea of nationalism is basically essentially to create a national prison to make sure people can't leave. And that's the idea, is to basically create. That's why nationalism and socialism are both considered authoritarian systems. Nationalism essentially boxes off people from being able to leave, and basically wants to beat down people on when it comes down to their personal liberty, and it wants to basically steal that away, so basically they get beaten down, and says you can't leave, and wants to basically make them essentially property. And it does this through actually dividing people by race and ethnicity, and basically wants to say that everybody outside is the enemy. So basically, when you're getting beaten down inside the system, that you're not they make you so worried about people outside of your country that you're not worried about what's actually happening internally, about all of the abuses that are currently happening. Now, in socialism, they basically do it through making people fight over income level. So there really is not much of a difference between the two. Now, in socialism, they do have to. Now, here's where we need to talk about the differences. Now, basically, here's where we need to talk about what the actual definition of fascism is first. Now, fascism is basically, they misuse this definition deliberately. Fascism is the reason why is because the true definition of fascism was actually coined in Italy as an actual grouping between the government and business, and this was based. this is actually the actual definition. Now it's actually changed around with it to basically, number one, to protect this idea of what this is. They now call this they now call it a mixed economy. And it's number one to protect this idea of the mixed economy, because that's essentially what the Keynesian economists rely upon. And number two, it's also to protect the idea of the nationalists. So basically, so nationalists don't basically have their so they can basically run nationalism in the modern era without basically being busted with having something have such a negative idea. And so basically, so the nationalism of the past was basically branded as fascism, when that's really wasn't the proper term. Fascism was merely one of the two economic systems that they were actually running upon. They would run either A, fascism, or B, they would be running under fascism, or they'd be running under socialism. They didn't really care. Now, the difference between that and an actual socialist is socialists would always be running under a socialist economic policy. Now, when you compare that with an actual, with what socialists would also do, socialists would have no problem going with using nationalism, because eventually, when you get a socialist economic policy, you deal with the idea of problems of productivity. Being that in the ideal socialist system, that socialism is going to basically create where everyone's paid the same, assuming that there isn't corruption. There's corruption. Obviously, they're going to be stealing from the people, and obviously lowering that level down with it. But in theory, with it, that basically that everybody's going to be paid the same. So anybody making the average amount is going to be at level of where they should be paid, and then anybody making anybody that's below that average level of production is going to be earning more than they should be paid. But anybody that's above average level production is actually underpaid. So that creates a huge risk of those people that are high producers, that either A, they're going to start slacking off, and that creates a huge risk for the country to lose production levels, or B, these people are just going to flat out leave, and they'll leave to a country that is either A, under a fascist system, because even a fascist system will give them some type of incentive for their work, or B, they will find some type of system that's closer to capitalism, because obviously it doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed for a long time, but they're going to get the closest that they can get to that. And and even when they get to that new nation with it, they will actually advocate for capitalism, for the government to get out of the way of business, so that they can actually succeed to a maximum level. And what this means is that you're going to actually lose all these productive workers. Now, to fix this problem, their idea is to adopt nationalism, to block them from leaving. And this is what many socialist nations have done over the years. Theoretically, what this means: create a border. And this idea of these borders, they're not to protect people from coming in and stop some type of like reduction of wage or anything like that, like how a lot of nationalists have said over the years. That's not what it's for. And some type of protectionist like that. That's not what it's for. It's to actually stop you from leaving. This is the whole purpose of what borders are to do. It's the same idea as the way a prison works. They don't put these actual walls and gates up in prisons to keep people from actually visiting. They keep it so people don't leave. That's the sole idea, and it works the same way. It's to keep you from actually leaving. And that's the way that's the whole idea of why they actually do it. Because if they actually created it like that with it, it would actually be the idea that these things would actually be effective for people entering. And they're not effective for people entering. They're completely ineffective. I mean, we look at the numbers with it, they're completely ineffective. I mean, they're just as bad as when it comes down to the levels of the TSA, when it comes down to ineffectiveness for people coming in, for those who are concerned about people actually coming in. Even though we've gone with discussions on when it comes down to the U.S. immigration law, where it is completely unconstitutional. But when we start to look at that, that means that's not what it's about. It's about keeping people from leaving. Because if they were to leave, that would actually cause an issue with the people that are actually too productive. They would actually leave and actually go to areas that are actually better for cost for those who are more productive. Low cost, high productivity, which will actually put more wealth in their pockets, instead of basically being deal with a lot of high inflation and deal with the ending problems of the nation that are actually building up. They don't want people to actually leave and actually get wealth elsewhere. They're trying to basically block wealth from leaving. This is the idea of that's what the point of nationalism is here in the United States. Is the number one, block wealth from leaving, because what they're doing is they're adding a massive amount of debt, and they're trying to basically steal money from people because they're adding a massive amount of debt, and it's causing a massive amount of inflation. And they're never going to mark it up in CPI, because they would essentially have to lead to cost of living increases. And they don't want to deal with that, because that essentially goes on to, obviously, Social Security and other types of increases. And that would affect the market. That would affect obviously certain areas of the marketplace. And they would essentially have to realize that it's a whole big house of cards. And it caused massive changes. And they'd have to realize that the whole system of the fascist economy is a joke. And eventually it would collapse. That's why they've been pushing nationalism, at least we're talking like 140 years. And it's why people bought into this garbage. And it's why why socialism isn't what it called threat, is because there is no actual idea of growing socialism on any type of legitimate scale. Because when it comes down to it, is nationalists with it, they tend to have a better idea of hiding it, whereas socialists with it, they're pretty well open when they say things, and you can pretty much tell them outright with it. When it comes down to nationalists, they usually try to lure in other groups with it by saying other things, and then they flip to a nationalist ideology very, very quick. So when it comes down to the dangers of nationalism, we need to understand with it when we look at it. I mean, even when it comes down to it, is the dangers. I mean, we can see with it, obviously, we know the dangers of socialism, but when it comes down to the dangers of nationalism, I mean, they're so dangerous that they've even had to basically change the actual names of it with it over the years with it, just to basically keep it going. Socialism, obviously, we know the dangers of that with it. We have history books galore. Everybody talks about it. But with nationalism, we can go back to Nazi Germany. Nazis were nationalists. And this is specifically when you get to these groups like this. In many ways with it, when you look at Stalin was a nationalist. If you look at what he called the areas that he targeted, he actually targeted to starve and to punish people who were not part of his groups. In many ways, Mao itself was a nationalist with it, because anybody that was not part of when he did the cult, when he did I believe his there was a cultural revolution with it. It was basically anybody that was actually in the farming communities with it. He that was actually out in the West. He essentially theoretically killed off, and anybody that was near the ocean areas with it, he essentially was supporting. And when we start to look at this is where we start to see more nationalism get involved with socialism. We've seen this usually when socialism tends to be very, very violent with it. That's what ends up happening. We see in Burma, even though they are economically socialist, you can see definitely they're a nationalist country. When we when we see the and then when we go back to like the conflicts with Hitler with it, Hitler had what it calls basically they didn't have the option of basically of capitalism with it because of the Treaty of Versailles and all the stuff like that with it. So what ended up happening with it was high conflicts between what were anti-fascists, which were essentially socialists, and you had Hitler, which was a nationalist. Hitler and his people, which were nationalists, who had these conflicts that would constantly go on. And obviously, there were progressives that were in power before. And that this is basically what was going on in Germany. For those who wanted to actually know, this wasn't exactly something that was where Hitler was some type of socialist. Hitler was not a socialist. He merely used that economic system for his benefit. He could have used he could have used fascism just as much. He would have had no problem using it. As we see even in the modern day fascists, anti-fascists, we actually see that they actually separate Nazis from the idea of fascism. They're anti-fascist, and anti-Nazi. That should be a little bit of a key for people to actually look at that. If they're if the idea of going after these things was actually a big deal with. Now, the reason why they're anti-fascist, which is basically a mixed economy, is because they wanted to be centrally controlled. These are socialists. And the reason why they're anti-Nazi, Nazis are nationalists. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be part of the quote-unquote Nazi party. It means you're a nationalist. So when they say they're quote-unquote punching a Nazi with it, yes, as a libertarian, we believe in the non-aggression principle with it, which is wrong to basically just show aggression toward people out of nowhere. With it, technically, with them doing that, with them going and punching a nationalist, technically, that is actually their target. A nationalist and a Nazi are the same thing. I hate to tell people this, but yes, it's the truth. This is not them accusing this is not them basically blindly accusing nationalists of being a Nazi when it's not true. It's true. Because they're the same thing. A nationalist is a Nazi, and vice versa. It's not some type of blank accusation, because Nazis were nationalists, and and basically when they use that accusation, there's a reason why they want to go after the people with it. When they talk about also going after the KKK and groups like that with it, that's what they're talking about. They're talking specific groups with them. So when they talk about Nazis, they're actually talking about nationalists. It's why they're not what it called. So basically, pretty much, if you're a nationalist, you're pretty much on their kind of target list, and it's why pretty much if you're wearing the MAGA hat, pretty much they view that as kind of a symbol of nationalism just as much as if you're wearing any of those things that are pretty much the uniforms of one of those one of those kind of militant groups, three percenters, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers that are nationalist groups as well. And that's kind of what ends up happening is that's why Antifa in the United States, as well as Antifa abroad, is actually attacking these people. Not saying it's right to actually just attack people outright, but that's what it's from. Now, we've also seen on the other side with it that there's basically attacking people outright or basically antagonizing it for usually videos with it outright. They're basically trying to antagonize. What you do is you antagonize them first, and then once they fight back, you start the video. We've seen a lot of nationalist activists that claim themselves as journalists or have actually been guilty of doing this stuff. And I don't want to actually give them what it called any airtime for the ones that are actually doing this, but I think you got an idea of who these people are. They'll appear a lot of times on on the Fox News primetime hours of these opinion hosts, the Laura Ingrams, the Hannitys, the Tucker Carlsons. These are the ones they end up appearing on the show, and they act as and they get labeled as journalists when they're not. There's activist hosts. There's activist videographers. They're not actually journalists, because journalists, you'd actually have to do something and be part of actual stories, not just basically be an actual videographer where you're basically trying to antagonize people and then try to start a fight. I mean, basically, it's nothing more than pretty much violent TikTok fights. That's pretty much what they're doing. Nothing more than that. I mean, and that's pretty much what they're actually doing on that part. So when we start to see that's what's happening, and that's what's happening kind of in the modern day thing. And the reason why this is why when we start to view nationalism as kind of very dangerous is it has what it called is not only is it does it have this link of a lot of these activist videographers, a lot of people on the right wing, all the people in the right wing media that are actually pushing this garbage. You also have people, when it comes down to the right wing politicians, they're either cowards to call any of this stuff out. I mean, beyond basically a handful of people with it, there's not many. But it's from the local offices to the state offices, the federal offices that are basically they're either being cowards about it, B they're kind of like they refuse they're basically being complicit with it, or C they're actual members and supporting it. And this is what's happening out there, and they think they can do this to try to control all this. So they think they can get it to their own advantage. And they've transformed the GOP into some type of thing that it's never been. Instead of being essentially conservative, as we've talked before about the diamond shape of politics, it's not linear, it's actually a diamond shape. And you have at the top, you have basically on the top part of the diamond, on the left side of that top with it, you have socialism, and right next to it, on the right side of it, you have nationalism. And if you go on the left side of the diamond, you get progressivism. On the right side, you have conservatism. In the center, you have you have your centrists, and all the way in the bottom, you have libertarians. So if we start to look at like how Trump got elected, well, Trump basically got elected in 2016 he pissed off a lot of the conservatives and was trying to basically make some promises in 2016 to libertarians, saying, well, I'll get these few things done. And when by 2018 he didn't get anything done in that list, by 2018 all libertarians were gone. And that's why by 2020 and even all of his special elections with it, by 2018 he ended up suffering massive losses. By 2020 he ended up suffering a big loss there, and this is why they're dealing with a party that's basically filled with a bunch of crazies, because the regular GOP people are like not really wanting to actually deal with the party. Many of them even left to the Democratic Party, and the libertarians don't want to deal with Trump at all because he lied and went completely nationalist, and so the party's just left with a bunch of nationalist people, and the party's starting to disintegrate. And obviously, nobody wants to deal with nationalists because that's authoritarian. And when you look at that's why when you start to look at these things, is you're going to see that that is the actual clear biggest threat. When you have one of the two largest parties that's actually authoritarian, it is going to be an actual serious threat and out there with it. And that you don't find socialism out there at all with it. They don't really have an actual voice in the nation. When you have the other one that's actually, number one, undermining elections, number two, is putting in draconian things to stop people from voting because they don't have any ideas of their own that are actually promoting liberty and helping people out. And then number three is all they're trying to do is basically get to the point of worshiping some type of nationalist leader. It ends up going to where they're going to basically have to go downhill, and eventually they're going to realize that it's not going to work out well. And in the end, this is what it's looking at. Then we start to, especially when you look at historically, nationalism doesn't work out well, specifically when it gets found out. Once it gets found out, it doesn't play out well. Then when you start to look at going back to the other thing with the idea of them trying to go with the idea of saying that some type of like nationals, and some of these people on there are believing that there's like a whole big thing where we have to worry about some national like global socialist government coming about. It's not even plausible. As we've seen with it, every type of iteration of that idea that's actually come out is impossible, because it would basically, number one, financially it would collapse under its own weight. We've seen socialist governments with it that even just governments themselves with it, they've lasted decades with it, but it's been under heavy nationalism that they've done it with it, and they've fallen under massive debt. And they've done it with it basically by the people still believing in the actual government by actual violent force. You're not going to do that over a whole world with it. You can't do that, because the fact is there's no actual legitimate reason that you can actually use violent force over a whole world. What's keeping everything together? There's no glue with it. You don't have any ability to sustain any type of censorship of the internet or anything like that with it, because the internet's now a global thing. What can you? There's no ability to block the free movement of ideas at all now. People now can move from country to country, and this becomes a implausibility. Even if you're stopping with the actual internet, people can move from country to country and spread information any other which way, and there's no ability to stop it. And this is the whole point. And if nobody can stop that, that means that there's no ability to actually to actually stop people from having any free exercise of their liberty. You'll also come up with systems of free trade as well that are going to be outside of the bounds of this so-called socialist global system, and you're not going to be able to stop it, because when you get all this idea of free travel and stuff like that, the idea of how socialists worked with it to basically get people in line is to restrict them, to restrict their travel, to restrict their movement. If you basically say that people can move all they want, you're not going to be doing this. This is exactly the opposite. You cannot basically say, hey, you're able to freely move. And they also say that they're basically going to improve technology and all this stuff with it. That's not how basically things work. These ideas of these futuristic dystopias, that's not how things work realistically. You don't improve technology, basically give people free stuff, and actually create some type of dystopia. That's not how things work. The idea with it would actually be to put people theoretically in a stone age and basically try to basically make things as hard on them as possible. Take every bit of technology and advances away from them to break them, and actually take the ability for them to move from place to place. You want to restrict movement, and you want to basically restrict the ability for them to gain technology, not for them to actually add technology. This is the most insane ideas that they've actually come up with. And this is why when you get these nationalists coming up with these ideas, this is the most insane things. It's because what nationalists have is a fear of change. And that's merely what it is. They had this unreal idea of what yesteryear was like, and they thought yesteryear was so great when it wasn't. All the vehicles of yesteryear were horrible, because and all the advances that they've come up with since then with it make vehicles far better, far safer, far more fuel efficient, and the actual power on the vehicles are far better. You're getting better gas mileage and actually better power from them. You look at what are called the most powerful vehicles now with it, and they're far more powerful than they were back then. And the engine sizes are far smaller, making them far more efficient. I mean, you look at cars now, like the fastest cars now with it are basically far faster than we could ever have back then. You look at the way everything is done now, it's far more efficient than it was back then. And as we start to go more and more technologically advanced, you look at medicine far more technologically advanced. And they act like if we go back in time with it, like it's supposed to be better. It's like, yeah, you can have your archaic back in time things with it. Our ideas of going to the future with are going to be far better. And there is no ideas of this like sci-fi dystopia with it, like it's supposed to be like that with it. This is just for just for the movies, nothing more. And I think it's insane when people start to think this way. And it's all it is basically to drum up another conspiracy theory that's impossible and improbable in every which way. And when they start to say with it, oh, companies are going to get together and do this with it, what companies are going to go against their own self-interest of selling products, and they say there's going to be some type of like, also I've heard ideas of some type of like population, like a depopulation of the world. What companies are going to go against their own self-interest and want to depopulate the world which would mean they get less money when money's actually a major concern of theirs. They're not going to want to actually essentially burn up dollars. If they wanted to actually lose money with it, they would actually do it right now. They would just incinerate their money, give it away with it at massive, like billions upon billions of dollars, just hand it away, or just basically hand away free products to people. Just stop selling products with it and just give everything away for free. As well as instead with it, they would just basically start giving away not only products to people, they actually start giving away not only products but actually money to people as well to take the product. Basically, like let's say if you want the newest version of a Microsoft product, not only are they going to give it to you for free, they're actually going to pay you to take it. You want the next version of some type of like a Microsoft Word with it, hell, they're going to actually pay you to take it. Okay, sorry, there was a comment. And there was basically pointing out they're trying to say that things were cheaper back in like the 50s and 60s when it's completely erroneous. When you start to actually calculate for inflation, you'll actually find out that that actually they were far more expensive. And they don't actually accommodate for things that they want to try to bring up certain things with it, and they don't accommodate for things such as inflation in certain areas, and that happens to be with purchase power in a couple different areas. But when we start to look at the overall actual cost of the overall actual wealth in the actual people, when it comes to everything as a whole, you'll actually see that people globally are actually far wealthier. And when you actually follow the actual people themselves, you'll actually see that they are actually far more, they actually are far wealthier as the years go on with it, and specifically going back generation to generation. This has actually been calculated by different people over the years with it. When you actually start to follow the same exact people, not just not just going by generation to generation, because if you tend to follow, like, let's say you tend to follow 18-year-olds, you're going to find out that the 18-year-olds are actually you're not going to find any income gain with it, because what ends up happening is you're actually going with new people. and you're never going to find any income change, and this is where you get erroneous data, and it's why the actual data is not accurate. Now, what ends up happening with it is, as I've stated before, it's this fascist economic system that actually creates in certain areas such as healthcare and education. And that was due to something called we were not actually intervening in having our government intervene in this whole marketplace, as I said, with it. And this is basically something in which I stated with it that either the globe has and he stated another thing with it, that basically they're trying to say that that homelessness, and they're saying that the whole thing, but now he doesn't understand, or he or she doesn't understand that basically they're saying that on lack of savings. This goes down to the whole thing of actual intervention into the marketplace. This is what we call fascism. This is basically what ends up happening is we have a central bank that is intervening. And when they're saying they're saying homelessness, this is not we're not seeing any more than what we saw back then. This is a fact. And we see full-time workers can't afford housing in most cities. This is because what they're doing is we have the central bank which is trying to basically put their thumb on the actual asset prices on the actual cities. I usually don't. This is not what it's really meant for this actual topic with it, but I will go into it. And what ends up happening with these asset prices is they're actually inflating asset prices. Now, what's happening is this is basically inflating asset prices, even though no wealth is actually gained. And what ends up happening is that this is actually causing issues with the actual prices of these things, meaning that things are inflating up in price. This is where I was talking about inflation. And then he's saying that most Americans have less than $500 in savings and are one paycheck from homelessness. There's nobody one paycheck from homelessness. I'm sorry with it, but that's talking hyperbole. And saying 500 most have less than $500 in savings. This is due to what we end up seeing with the central banks actually trying to basically keep the actual rate of interest down, so we actually don't rack up in debt. And he says the U.S. is a corporate. There is no such thing as corporate fascism form of government. Fascism it merely just means that the government works with business. There is no such thing as corporate fascism. That shows you that he doesn't understand what he's talking about. Rather than the constitutional republic as intended, the constitutional republic does not come into play with that. That shows you that he or she does not understand what they are talking about. And when it comes down to it, is there is no such thing as this idea of corporate fascism. What does that even mean? And fascism just means, when it comes down to, it's government and business coming together. It does not mean what. This just means that basically what they're actually doing is the government is intervening with business. It does not matter. Now I know what I'm talking about. Fascism is merely just business coming together with the government. It's there's no such thing as corporate fascism. You're just basically trying to mix something together that actually does not exist. And these are basically essentially Marxist talking points with it when they try to do these things of blaming corporations. And these are actual points that we end up seeing. And when we And when it comes down to the constitutional republic with it, this has nothing to do with the actual constitutional republic. This actually has to do with the actual economy as itself. And there's nothing that actually has to do with the actual constitution, with what they actually say with the economy in itself. What actually happens to be the problem actually happens to be with the actual problem with the central banking. Now we don't, the central bank actually was actually as it actually passed through a constitutional amendment. It actually is what is actually the source of the issue, because what they're doing is they're intervening in the actual system. There is nothing in the Constitution that once they did that amendment that says that they can't do that. What needs to happen is they need to eliminate that. That's why the statement about a constitutional republic as intended is erroneous. And that's why the idea of the term corporate fascism doesn't make any sense, because there is no corporate fascism. It's either fascism or it isn't fascism. And the idea of fascism, when we're talking about that, that's basically is when government is trying to put its thumb on the scales of business. I can see the person most likely left. And basically what we're talking about here is that basically what we're talking about is fascism is merely when you put your thumb on the scale and you're basically trying to eliminate the ability for people to for an actual free market to exist. And that's basically what a free market would be, basically just capitalism. Fascism is basically where the government is working with business and is trying to, as together with it, trying to intervene, also called a mixed economy. There is no such thing as corporate fascism. While corporations are the most likely to benefit from fascism because they're the largest, basically going to be the largest recipients of it, there's no reason to say that certain industries are not going to benefit from it. But corporate fascism is not a thing. That's the whole point of this, is that that's not a thing with it, and that's what this person does not understand. I'm basically going to cut it here because I'm nearly at an hour, and I kind of got off topic because this person was trying to make things up with it and was trying to basically going on Marxist talking points, and I'm basically going to cut it here, and bye everyone.